Good afternoon. Today we're talking about North Korea's nuclear missile program and its ballistic missile programs and seeing whether we can rationalise them with our four gathered experts. So primarily we have Haozan talking about the history of the regime, we have Henna talking about the foreign policy, we have Matt who will be joining us on the phone on the floor in North Korea to talk about the security dilemma, and we have David going through the theories behind it all. So to start us off, Haozan, why don't you tell us a little bit about the history of the regime?
Okay. I think to begin with, it's quite important to distinguish between the term rational that is being used here. This is not merely the casual rationality that is used to assess how sound-minded a person is, but rather in the context of international relations, which means that a country's government is able to make intelligent and reasonable decisions on its goals and aims in relation to its diplomatic, economic and military resources.
Scrutinizing North Korea's nuclear proliferation and its ballistic missile program from a historical perspective, we can see that it dates back to the establishment of the regime after the Korean War under the rule of Kim Il-sung. In the 1960s, North Korea established a nuclear research center, and the operation of a nuclear reactor received from Soviet Union began in 1967. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed by North Korea in 1985. However, in 1993, North Korea announced its intent to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but eventually opted to continue participating in it. These remain as claims by North Korea until 2003, when they officially withdrew from the treaty. Under the treaty, North Korea was barred from making nuclear weapons, but it said that was pulling out with immediate effect, blaming US aggression for its decision. In 1992, the two Koreas signed the South-North Joint Declaration on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Under the declaration, both countries agreed to not test, manufacture, produce, receive, possess, store, deploy, or use nuclear weapons, or to possess nuclear reprocessing and uranium enrichment facilities. They also agreed to mutual inspection for verification. In 1994, North Korea announced its withdrawal from the International Atomic Energy Agency. This is distinct from pulling out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. North Korea is still required to undergo IAEA inspections as a part of its NPT obligations. The IAEA contends that North Korea's safeguards agreement remains in force. However, North Korea no longer participates in IAEA functions as a member state. Later in 1994, North Korea and the United States signed an agreement. Among other stipulations, North Korea pledges to freeze and eventually dismantle its nuclear reactors in exchange for international aid to build 2 new light water nuclear reactors. The Kim dynasty is a 3-generation lineage of North Korea, which continued under the rule of Kim Jong-il when North Korea's president Kim Il-sung died. Kim Jong-il tested nuclear weapons in 2006 and 2009. Arguably, under the rule of Kim Jong-il, the nuclear program developed by North Korea and its threats were considered minor and insignificant. In 2013 and 2016, when Kim Jong-un came to power, nuclear tests were conducted, and this is the time period when North Korea's nuclear program underwent significant changes. North Korea has proved its possession of nuclear weapons through nuclear testing and its continual launching missiles under international sanctions placed on North Korea. The UN has imposed its hardest sanction against North Korea, with the Security Council's unanimous vote to punish the North Korean regime for the development of ballistic missiles. These sanctions include the export and import into and from North Korea, as well as joint ventures between North Korea and foreign companies, amongst others, which, as we can see, has had destructive effects on North Korean economy. Timeline of the missile launches and tests conducted by North Korean regime showcases an all-time escalation in 2017 as a result of foreign policy affairs. In September 2017, North Korea conducts its 6th nuclear test, claiming the device tested was a hydrogen bomb and the test was a perfect success.
Right, thank you very much, Haozan, for your historical perspective on the regime. Now moving it forwards into the foreign policy element with Henna, if you'd like to take it away.
Yeah, so foreign policy often begins with a sense of false urgency, and the idea of Kim Jong-un hoping to start a war has little evidence, and actually North Korea has been mostly restrained. Most experts say that the main obsession of North Korean leaders is regime or survival. In the 1990s, North Korea and the USA signed an agreed framework under which North Korea commits to freezing its nuclear program in return for heavy fuel oil and 2 light water nuclear reactors. North Korea then announces it will no longer be able to abide by the armistice that ended the Korean War, and they fire a long-range rocket well beyond their known capacity. From 2002, USA and its Asian allies Japan and South Korea halt oil shipments after hearing of North Korea's secret to having been developing a uranium-based nuclear program. North Korea then announces it is reactivating its nuclear facilities and then goes on to expel any UN inspectors from the region. The six-party talks then start in 2003, and over the next 3 years, North Korea openly admits for the first time that it has produced nuclear weapons for self-defense. North Korea then go on to fire 7 missiles, reportedly having the capability to hit the US, and they also conduct their first nuclear weapons test at an underground facility. The UN, from this, imposes economic and commercial sanctions on North Korea. Nuclear tensions then rise from 2009, when North Korea launches a rocket, which they said is carrying communications satellites, and the UN Security Council condemns North Korea, which also prompts North Korea to walk out of the six-party talks and restart its nuclear facilities. This continues into 2013, when North Korea's sole allies, China, bans any exports to North Korea of items that can be used to make missiles for nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, and the verbal attacks between North Korea and USA are exchanged with accusations of cyber attacks over a Sony picture film, The Interview. This film mocks Kim Jong-un and prompts new US sanctions the following month. The nuclear push then starts in 2015, where the US imposed new sanctions on North Korea over weapon proliferation. The UN Security Council further tightens sanctions by aiming to cut one of North Korea's main exports, coal, by 60%. Tensions rise in war of words with US over North Korean threats to fire ballistic missiles near the US Pacific territory of Guam. This brings us to the current situation of tension between not only North Korea and the USA, but also their allies.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for your foreign policy views. Sure we'll all take a lot from that to take forward into the end conversation. Now moving to Matt on the ground in North Korea, who's joining us by satellite phone. So Matt, if you can hear us,
Yeah.
floor's all yours.
Hi there up in the studio, I can hear you loud and clear, hope you can hear me. I'm going to be going through the security dilemma today, and just want to leave you with an opening quote of: the problem with North Korea isn't that we can't trust them, it's that they can't trust us. So just telling you a little bit about the security dilemma to start with, also known as the spiral model, centres pretty centrally around 2 states, both preferring the status quo and a non-conflict situation. However, they don't realise that the other feels this way. This therefore may lead to development of militaries and weaponry in State A, causing concern in State B, and as a reaction, the development of their own. This can then lead to conflicts, as both sides feel that any other movement is an aggressive or threatening action. So backing up with this, I've managed to speak to a friend of mine, Robert Jervis, who's centred around perception and misperception in international politics at the University of Columbia. So he says that state leaders tend to see themselves as non-threatening and somewhat assume that the others know this. So therefore, in relation to this spiral model, another state arming themselves can only be seen as an aggressive action. So they know that we pose no threat, so their actions must be aggressive towards us. However, upon further reading into this, the security dilemma also relies on states not wanting a regime change. Now looking into this, Rex Tillerson claims that the US don't want a North Korean regime change, yet we also feel that these views can't necessarily be 100% true, as the US is also viewed as being a somewhat attempted revisionist power in North Korea. So the example that this relates to that might be seen in Kim Jong-un's example is looking to Libya. So he would have seen the Gaddafi regime sat there negotiating the sort of shutdown of their nuclear power and also receiving aid in response. But would have also seen that NATO still later intervened to help overthrow him, showing and supporting the original quote that North Korea can't trust us. This offers some rationale behind the programs, And really, why should they trust us? History shows they shouldn't. Also, I feel North Korea is beyond the security dilemma, in the sense that tensions have not entirely risen accidentally via this spiral model. It brings in a sense of classic anarchy. With no overseeing power to oversee the North Korean-US agreements, the situation is based on the credibility of their word, and as I've just mentioned, and shown throughout history, the word isn't necessarily gospel here. Therefore, the situation is currently building towards a position of mutually assured destruction.
Thank you very much, Matt, for your views on the security dilemma. We'll be moving on now, and we hope you get out of North Korea soon. Hope to hear from you soon. So, moving it forward from that, we'll be taking it to our fourth expert, David, to discuss the theories behind the regime and its nuclear program.
Hello there, my name is David, and I will be covering the topic pertaining to North Korea's proliferation and the rationale behind it. What's important to note is that I will be using the theories of realism and constructivism to depict North Korea's behavior. This is really salient because if one is to understand the rationale behind North Korea's behavior, you need to view it from a certain scope or lens.
The theories of realism and constructivism are going to be applied within this documentary. The purpose behind this is to further contextualize and attempt to explain North Korea's proliferation and the rationale behind it. Beginning with realism, the theory stems from precursors such as Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. There are two strands of realism that will be addressed within this documentary, and that will be classical realism and neo-realism.
Now, realism has a set of universalist assumptions pertaining to state behavior within the international system. These assumptions do derive from realist notions about human nature, and these assumptions assert that human nature is egocentric, power-driven, and self-indulgent. Realism favors pessimism and will deem any rationale that eschews the Machiavellian depiction of the international system as unrealistic. Henceforth, realism would deem theories such as liberalism that actually allude to the prospect of cooperation or propensity of cooperation among states as unrealistic. From a classical realist perspective, North Korea's proliferation of nuclear weapons is completely rational, and it is typical and it is the modus operandi of states. Since states are naturally power-driven and self-seeking, the need to survive and ensure survival actually justifies or further even explains North Korea's proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Digressing from classical realism and shifting onto neo-realism, neo-realism focuses on how the structure of a system affects the agents within the system. In regards to the international system, neo-realism focuses on how anarchy affects the states within the international system. So, in regards to North Korea, neo-realism will focus on how anarchy has bred an international system characterized by a security dilemma. Due to this security dilemma, states need to ensure their own security and ensure that they are safe from any potential threats. Since there is no international police or international regulating body to regulate the behavior of states, it is a state's job to ensure its own security against the mishaps of other states. Henceforth, from a neo-realist perspective, North Korea's behavior and the proliferation of nuclear weapons is again completely rational, since North Korea has the prerogative to actually ensure its own security and to protect itself from potential threats preemptively if it need be.
Moving on from realism, the theory of constructivism focuses on how states' reality is constructed and also focuses on how a threat is identified based on the construction of a state's reality. Constructivism criticizes realism for having ontological predispositions in regards to human nature and the behavior of a state. As discussed earlier, realism assumes that humans and likewise the state are power-driven and egocentric and self-indulgent. Constructivism finds that notion to be without critical inquiry and epistemology. It is unwise to assume that human nature is universalist or fixed. There's many empirical happenings and much empirical evidence that actually proves that behavior and on human nature isn't necessarily true, since, for example, states cooperate. And since states cooperate, it does render void the assumption that states are always power-seeking. If states are cooperating with each other, they're not power-seeking, but looking to aggrandize both themselves and the other.
Now, in regards to the explanation behind North Korea's behavior under the lens of constructivism, constructivism focuses on how the internal and external factors within the state and the international system constitute a state's behavior. According to constructivism, North Korea's proliferation of nuclear weapons is a result of internal and external factors. These internal factors being factors such as the Kim dynasty, realist-centric thinking, history and insecurity, and the external factor being anarchy, for example. So what constructivism has done here has congruently mixed both the internal and external factors to describe how North Korean reality is shaped, and hence why North Korea perceives the international system or states within the international system to be a threat. Looking at the Kim dynasty, it is rational to actually deem the reasoning behind the Kim dynasty to be realist-centered, since the Kim dynasty does view the international system from the lens of power and does have this perception that North Korea is locked in a security dilemma and a power game whereby they have to protect themselves from possible enemies and threats and act preemptively. This is why they proliferate nuclear weapons, to be precise. In terms of its history, the reason why North Korea is very isolationist and why they are proliferating nuclear weapons also boils down to the fact that they have a perception of self that is very strongly exempt from the other in terms of integration within the international system. So when the international system was globalized, states did integrate to the point whereby states trade with each other, to the point whereby they've established treaties, and the UN is one of the largest bodies within the international system, constituting of states from every continent. However, North Korea decided to secede from the international system due to the fact that North Korea wanted to keep proliferating nuclear weapons. Now, what the secession from the UN is actually indicative of in regards to North Korea is that North Korea, as previously expressed, has a strong perception of self. Now, in regards to why North Korea feels the need to continue proliferating and actually to the point whereby they isolated themselves from the global community and began to develop nuclear programs, North Korea might feel under threat because the West, in terms of the integration of the global community, has actually influenced a lot in terms of capitalism, in terms of westernization, and actually perceive their identity to be under a threat, for example. What also must not be ignored is the fact that the Kim dynasty has its own personal interest in terms of retaining the status quo within North Korea and remaining in leadership in terms of rulership over North Korea. Now, in order to do this, North Korea does need the other, since what the Kim dynasty has been peddling over generations has been this fear politics, in which the Kim dynasty, or the leader within the Kim dynasty at the time, is the sole protector of North Koreans against all threats. Looking at the isolationism and the consistent proliferation of nuclear weapons, one might say that it is almost a ploy of the Kim dynasty in order to maintain the status quo within their regime.